Hello, my friends. Welcome to another installment in our study of world mythology. And we're still here in this section called the God as archetype. And we're looking at really the supreme being archetype still. We've looked at it in several iterations or forms. And today I want to think about the last two forms that we're going to take a look at, namely the dying God and the trickster. So this video is really about three things: the dying God, the theme of sacrifice, and the trickster God. And I want to weave those three threads into a single cord because I think they all have to do with the idea of willing sacrifice, letting go, what in Hinduism we call renunciation, surrender. And I think that's one of the pedagogical aspects, the teaching aspects of these two supreme being masks or archetypes, the dying God and the trickster. So let's see if we can accomplish that. Let's see if we can tie these three things together. Let's start with the dying God. The dying God is deeply interwoven with the great goddess, the great mother goddess. And as we've seen again and again and again, the great mother goddess, think of Mary and Jesus, is the sacred feminine presence that gives birth to the divine in physical form. And over again, we see that mother and son, the God-child, and the divine matrix of the divine feminine as the God-child's source. It was the backstory of the Buddha, and too many to mention here. And you know what comes to mind is cilantro, if I may take you on a little detour here. Cilantro, of course, is this beautiful, inexpensive, pungent herb that is an essential element in a lot of food that I make and a lot of food that you enjoy too. My guacamoles, my salsas, my Thai food. I love cilantro. It's a staple. I always buy it when I'm at the store. So I thought, hey, I'm going to grow some cilantro. I use it all the time. Wouldn't it be nice to have just, a bunch of it growing in the backyard? I can just grab a little bit when I need it. Okay, so I tried. And I got little cilantro plants and I put them in nice big pots and I watered them and they grew big. And after a couple of weeks, the leaves all turned yellow and they sent up this huge central, useless to me, stalk with a big flower bud on it, and it just went to seed. And so I gave up growing cilantro. It's pointless because cilantro doesn't live very long. And what I need, all those green leaves, it wasn't very good at producing. It seemed that the whole reason for existence of the cilantro plant was to create seeds for the next generation. It wasn't interested in what I wanted, a lot of those wonderful green leaves for my guacamole and my homemade carnitas, street tacos, and all that stuff. Cilantro didn't care about me. It just wanted to die and in its last death act, create a bunch of seeds for the next generation. Well, it got me thinking that these ancient agricultural societies, think the Egyptians, who rooted around the Nile Valley, that flooded like clockwork every year and deposited new topsoil in the valley. Sustainable agriculture is going to mean a rooted civilization, no longer following the herd, rooted in one place. And that's one of the triggers, really, isn't it, of civilization, rootedness, the birth of the city-state, civilization, economy, hierarchy, formal religion, government, taxation, the invention of writing, the class system, all of it can be traced back to the discovery of systematic agriculture. And those agricultural societies living close to the land like that, having intimate knowledge of the birth and death cycle of plants, of crops. You plant the corn, nice little green shoots come out of the ground. It grows into a big corn plant. There's a bunch of ears of corn on it, and then the corn plant dies, and those ears of corn become food, and they also become seeds for the next year's crop. of corn. In other words, for agricultural people, their mythology begins to reflect this cyclical process. They understand in a way that I don't think you and I do, that life and death are not opposites. Life and death are just 2 points on one circle. And that circle never stops spinning. It reminds me of that great line from Eckhart Tolle's book, Stillness Speaks. He says, life is not the opposite of death. The opposite of death is birth. Life has no opposite. This insight that the coming into form and the going out of form is just how the divine shows up in our life. It's how ultimate reality manifests itself in the field of form. What if the dying God is just a mythologized form of that fact, of the cyclical nature, that life comes from death and death comes from life? That harkens back to that idea we were thinking about in our Great Goddess video, that why is the Great Goddess ambiguous, as Leeming asks, an ambiguous figure? Because everything that's born is going to die. So everything that's born from the Great Goddess is death defined. Being born means dying, and dying means being reborn. That consciousness gets so deeply rooted in the human experience, perhaps, again, as I'm exploring with you here, perhaps germinated in our agricultural roots and taking form in all of our mythologies. Again and again and again, we see the dying God motif. And because the dying God is associated with agriculture, when the dying God dies, into the soil he goes. You know, Isis buries Osiris's body parts all over Egypt. And when Jesus is taken off of the cross, dead, and placed into the tomb, he stays in the tomb for 3 days. The God-child in death, the dying God, goes into the mother womb. The tomb becomes a womb, and there is always a rebirth. You can count on that, right? And we'll see that a lot when we get to the hero's journey later in the course, that it is out of the sacrifice or the death of the dying God that all the boons come, all the prizes and benefits and bounties and transcendence comes. So sometimes the dying God, whether it's Osiris or Jesus or countless others, sometimes they end up on a tree. Kind of like fruit on a tree, right? And fruit always contains the seed within itself. When you eat the apple, at the core there are those seeds, and you throw it away, and those seeds can become new apple trees for the next generation of apples. So the dying God hanging on trees, look for that motif. That's really common. Attis, Odin doesn't literally die at this point in the story, but he hangs himself on a tree for a while. Gets stabbed in the side just like Jesus does when he's hanging on his symbolic tree, the cross. Osiris, when he gets killed by Set, his evil brother, and placed in the sarcophagus and sent down the river, that river gets encased in the trunk of a tree, and Isis has to go find him. So curious how again and again and again in many of these stories the dying God ends up in a tree. Again, hearkening back to the fruit-growing agriculturalists who told these stories. Now, what about psychologically? That's always a fascinating window through which to peer into the house of the dying God. And sure, we could do a kind of Jungian Freudian analysis that psychologically the descent of the dying God is not literal, but down into the unconscious. And into the unconscious, then followed always, of course, by a reemergence, but this time more fully realized, in Jungian terms, integrated, or, transformed, all potentials realized. When Jesus comes out of the tomb, right? Look out. He's Jesus. He's God now, fully, and ascends bodily into heaven, as the Catholics claim. And Mary, too, ascended alive, bodily, into heaven, just flew up into heaven. So these are powerful stories about the profound transformation of the death and rebirth process. So we certainly see that in many of these dying God stories. So the death is, to put it plainly, necessary. It's not to be mourned and viewed with horror, shock, and regret, but it is to be understood as a essential stage in the transformation of the dying God's emergence into their full status. We'll see that again and again as we read through these. So what about the social aspect? Here's one last piece of the dying God that I think is so rich and is connected to all the other ones we just got through thinking about. The scapegoat idea. Look at this, how somehow the dying is good for society, that the dying God takes on himself and sometimes herself all of the sins, all of the iniquities or flaws of the people. That's the scapegoat. And this comes from a Hebrew ritual that's discussed in Leviticus. Chapter 16, verse 22, it says, "And the goat shall bear upon him all of their iniquities unto a land not inhabited." So in this annual ritual, all of the sins of the tribe would be symbolically pinned to this goat, and they would send the goat away out to be lost in the desert to die from exposure as a sacrificial lamb, as the one who carries our sins away, so that we have a shot at starting fresh. And this gets built into the Jewish ritual of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Jewish New Year's Day, and you can already hear it. It's like a freight train barreling into the station. When we get to the Christian era, of course, Jesus in the Jewish community is understood as, and is pitched as by Paul particularly, as the Lamb of God, as the sacrificial goat who takes on to himself all of the sins of the world. You hear it explicitly stated in the Gospel of John that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son in order that we might have everlasting life. So in classic mainline Christianity today, Christians hold and teach that idea that Christ died for your sins. The most famous scapegoat in history. So that's where the term scapegoat comes from. Jesus plays that role. Attis in his culture plays that role. Osiris certainly. Dionysus in the Greek tradition. So how is that connected to the theme of sacrifice? Well, obviously the dying God gives up their life, right? And I'm reminded of a great line from one of my favorite philosophers, the Stoic philosopher, the ancient Roman philosopher Epictetus. And I think about this line a lot, especially today. And so many of us are going through such hard times in this day and age of pandemic. Epictetus wrote, "The hardships we endure introduce us to our strengths." The hardships we endure introduce us to our strengths. Anybody listening to this can attest to that in their own experience. When you hit a wall, when you lost a job, when you became homeless, when all the money was gone, when you faced a life-threatening health challenge, when you got divorced, etc., when you were injured in battle or in violent crime or in an accident, or when the list goes on, when you faced a hardship, it either killed you or you dug down and found some undiscovered strength that was lying there all the time dormant and only emerged from the unconscious in the face of that brutal hardship or challenge. And so sacrifice changes us. And you see it in the Hebrew Bible, right? God is constantly asking the Hebrews, the Jews as they later come to be known, to sacrifice their herd, one of their herd. I mean, these are herdsmen. Their animals are precious. It's like God asking you to push your car off a cliff. It's like, why? Why does God want these Hebrews to take a perfectly good animal and slaughter it in homage to him. Just as when Noah gets off of the boat, you remember this from the flood story, right? As soon as Noah gets off the boat, just like in the epic, when Utnapishtim gets off the boat, the first thing they both do, this was a commonality in those two flood stories. The first thing they both do is they build an altar to the Lord and they make a sacrifice. And in Genesis, it says that, the new Adam, Noah, took some animals and sacrificed them. And then it says, and God loved the soothing aroma. So yeah. But what's sacrifice of animals really all about? Does God really enjoy you killing animals for him? I mean, why does he need that? What the heck could he possibly be getting out of that? Nothing. And it's kind of creepy in a way that he would ask that. So what's really at play? What about the story of Isaac and Abraham in Genesis, where God tells Abraham, the great patriarch, to kill his son, Isaac? I mean, human sacrifice. Now, God's really raising the stakes, and we'll look at that story maybe another day, but it ends well, right? Isaac survives. But nevertheless, the theme of giving something of great value up on the altar for God, what's all that about? I think it's really about transformation through renunciation. You're giving something up of great value to you. And the consciousness of the sacrificer is different than the consciousness of one who says, no, it's mine, I'm holding on to it. I worked hard for that, it's mine, no, you can't have it. The one who is willing to let go of it, that's an internal change. Maybe that's what God wants. Transformation through renunciation, through letting go. Because what really dies in that instance is our ego, our egoic attachments, and our fear-based need to control everything. I mean, if you're going to sacrifice something, you have to just let go and say, I don't see how this is going to help anything, but I trust and I'm going to do it. So maybe that broken openness is what God is after. Maybe that's what the ritual of sacrifice is trying to create. Campbell says rituals are reenactments of myths. A ritual is a reenactment of a myth. So when we perform the ritual of sacrifice, whether it's literally killing a goat on an altar or it's putting a $20 bill in the basket at church or in the synagogue or at mosque, giving of your time, your talent, your treasure, stuff that you kind of need for yourself, but you give it away. And the great spiritual truth in all the wisdom traditions is you only get to keep what you give away. No, I know that doesn't make any sense to the mind. What do you mean I only get to keep what I give away? The egoic mind can never understand that because it's a zero-sum game. If I give you something, I have less. But the soul understands this, and the dying God teaches us this, that through the act of sacrifice, we learn to let go. We learn to surrender. We enter into the consciousness of surrender. The ego knows sacrifice as a loss, but the soul knows sacrifice as a gain. Because when you shift into the consciousness of surrender, of acquiescence, of serenity, of trust, of faith, of grace, you have tapped a deep, profound power that is going to serve you far more richly than that little trinket that you just let go of. Through the ritual of sacrifice, we come to know that our real supports are invisible. Our real support system is invisible. It's not the money. I mean, you need some money, right? Don't give it all away. But, take care of your needs first. But there's a sense in which digging deep and giving really facilitates this shift. Now, let's connect that to the trickster, our final iteration of the masks of God idea, the supreme being archetype. The last mask we're going to look at is the trickster. And it really connects to the dying God and the theme of sacrifice in some surprising ways. Let's explore this here in our last few minutes. So throughout world mythology, of course, you see many versions of these so-called trickster gods, divine beings who come down and they aren't very nice, and they're either ridiculous, like stupid clowns, like how can that be God? Or they're kind of malicious, think about the clown in It, that's not such a stupid clown, it's a horrible monster. So this willingness of the trickster to lie, to cheat, to deceive, to sow mayhem and chaos, and to bring confusion, and then laugh about it. Why are there gods like this? What does this particular mask of God do for us? Again, going back to the mask of God idea that we made all the masks. So why did we gravitate toward this particular kind of God and tell this trickster God story in every culture? Well, it seems that they're here to remind us, aren't they? Again, that we are not in control, that the universe is prone to random acts of violence, volcanoes, tsunamis, earthquakes, wildfires, diseases, pandemics, large predators. You're hiking down the trail and a mountain lion gets you, or a great white shark, you're swimming off the coast of Leucadia and a great white shark just comes and pulls you down and you are now food and your family is planning a funeral. So where the heck does that fit in the benign universe scenario? It doesn't. So we're back to Campbell's cosmological metaphysical function. The myth must frame reality for us and make all the pieces fit together. Well, how do you fit cancer into this? You don't. Nobody wants it. It wrecks everything. This is what the trickster God's role is as one of the faces of God, to kind of give us the sinister face of nature, but in kind of almost a comical, laughable way. I guess the sinister face of nature just needed its own personification. And because this is how God shows up in the world too. Isn't that something we just have to say yes to? That if God is in the flower, then God is in the cancer cell too. You can't say, God just made all the pretty, beautiful stuff and all the bad stuff. I don't know why that's there, but it just is. So, and then there's this. If God appears before us in these kind of laughably clownish and ridiculous forms and sows mayhem and deceit wherever they go, and apparently enjoys wrecking stuff, think Loki, right? Loki is always one of your great paradigmatic trickster gods in Norse mythology. He is just dangerous. He's just dangerous. I don't know why he does what he does. Nobody, that's the point, right? You never know why Loki does what he does. He just takes great glee in destroying and wrecking what everybody else is trying to do. So, the great shapeshifter Loki. So, if God shows up in these clownish forms, maybe this is one of the final purposes of the trickster God, then we are not so gently reminded to look beyond the mask. You can't fall in love with Loki. You can't fall in love with a trickster God. They're annoying as hell and dangerous and kind of funny. And so they're compelling and wonderful characters to learn about and read about. They're very entertaining. But they break our slavish attachment to the mask. And this is always the danger, right? We thought about that in the Masks of God video, that humans are prone to the error of forgetting that they made the mask. They believe that their mask of God, their particular personification and version and concept of God is actually God. And then they go to war with the other people who have different metaphors and concepts. And the trickster God is here to blow all of that up and remind us, hey, let me grab you by the lapels, shake you up a little bit. Stop thinking that the mask is the God. Look at how ridiculous I look, the trickster God says. Look at how absurd my existence is. Obviously, I'm not the totality of ultimate reality. I'm just this farcical face. And so maybe that's one of the jobs the trickster God accomplishes also, is to get us to break our attachment to all God concepts and to realize that whatever God is, whatever ultimate reality is beyond all concepts, beyond all forms, beyond all categories of thought, and certainly beyond perception, and certainly deeply, infinitely, and transcendently beyond all masks. And the clownish trickster God makes that plain, doesn't he? So like I said in the Masks of God video, if you really want to know God, you have to forget everything you know about God. Or to say it in a slightly different way, if you really want to know God, you have to forget everything you think you know about God. All those ideas of God are like barbed wire that keep you out of the direct experience that one can attain in the depths of worship, meditation, prayer, ecstasy, transcendent vision, mystical vision, beyond all categories and concepts. So finally, putting these three things together, the dying God, the concept or the theme of sacrifice and the transformation that it affords, and the trickster God, weaving these three together into one chord. Do you ever think about this? Do you ever think that the role of Satan, the role of the devil in Christianity, isn't he a trickster God? Is Satan a trickster God? Now, I know we don't think that way in traditional mainline Christianity again, but here in the freedom of our inquiry into world mythology, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck and looks like a duck, it's kind of a duck. And Satan is, the story goes, he's one of the angels, right? And when God made Adam and Eve, God told all the angels to bow to Adam and Eve, and they refused. They all did except Satan, who refused. So Lucifer, as he's also known, refused to bow down to Adam and Eve. This is how the Muslim story goes. Because he loved God so much, he wouldn't split his loyalty between God and Adam and Eve. And so God, for violating God's commandment that Lucifer bow down to man, he got kicked out. So his hell was to be separated from the one he loved the most. So when you tell the story of Lucifer that way, Iblis in Arabic, or Satan as he sometimes comes to be called from the Hebrew shaitan, that idea really develops in the Middle Ages into the big idea that some Christians really use a lot, the idea of the devil or Satan. And so our friends, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they teach that, yes, God made the universe, but Satan rules the earth. That's why our JW friends try not to get engaged in the world. They teach that Satan rules the world through three institutions: big government, big corporations, and the Roman Catholic Church. So that's controversial, I know. This is why JWs often recruit heavily in traditionally Catholic neighborhoods. So that's one sect of Christianity, Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't represent all Christians, but there's a particularly acute form of really lifting Satan up to a really important, like, demigod kind of figure. And doesn't it raise questions for you about the infinite power of God? If God is omnipotent, that is to say, infinitely and limitlessly powerful, then God is clearly allowing Satan to exist. And if God created everything, then God created Satan too. And if you're going to posit the idea that Satan is at war with God and God is in some sort of cosmic struggle with Satan, that's not an omnipotent God. That's a God who is at war with another God who's just as powerful as he is. And yet the deeper realization is that Satan is a trickster God, a personification of yet one of the other facets of the divine. I don't want to concretize that into some new religious doctrine or anything. I'm just trying to follow the threads that come along, that when we consider the trickster God, the devil, is a pretty good version of the trickster God, who plays a very similar role to the role of trickster gods in other faith traditions. So be on the lookout for that in the other videos that we're going to see and in the other readings that we're going to do. And let's bring to a close then our study of the supreme being archetype. But trust me, as we go forward in this class, we're not going to leave behind the gods and goddesses. They'll stay with us forever through the other stories and themes that we'll be exploring for the rest of the semester. So see you on the other side.